Hey guys, today we are watching Misunderstood Moments in History, the Spartan Myth by Invicta. I am going to assume this is about the battle at Thermopylae, in which the 300 Spartans held off the... Not sure the exact number. I've heard ranges from like 100,000 to 1 million Persians. I think for the time period, 1 million is just absurd. I'm going to be honest. As I've studied more and more, I feel like for that time period, 1 million men? No. I think it's more reason. I think even 200,000 might possibly be pushing it for that time. I'm going to say 100,000. So what I'm guessing this is about how it wasn't just 300 Spartans that defended the pass at Thermopylae. It was a coalition of Greek city-states, etc., that were there to help hold off the Persian army. But in the end, they had this report that the Persians were going to encircle them. And I guess the Spartans were like, yo, everyone else, Athenians, I think there was 7,000 Athenians that went there. The Spartans were like, yo, you guys get out to fight another day or whatever. Prepare the defenses of Greece or something like that. And the 300 Spartans stayed there and fought to the last man. Oh, it's been a while since I've studied this area, so here we go.
Misunderstood Moments in History, the Spartan Myth. A huge thanks to our sponsors, the Great Courses Plus, for making this video possible. The Spartans, a group practically worshipped by popular culture and military institutions for producing the ultimate warrior. Badass super soldiers trained from childhood with unmatched strength, discipline, and courage.
Well, that's kind of what they were. They were trained from birth to become warriors. They were a very rigid society, which I think also leads to their downfall. Because they were so rigid, they were military. But because they didn't really have much of anything else in their society, aside from their amazing military prowess, they crumbled because of that. Because they couldn't adapt to other things. They didn't have, being a purely military society also kind of limits your population, because if you're so focused on war, the men are away at war, therefore you're not making babies. And without the babies, you don't have more soldiers to replenish any that die in war.
Battling against tyranny
Super brief explanation of military societies like the Spartans.
and oppression. Yet this narrative is a lie. A vast, millennia-long distortion of the truth built up by propaganda, biased sources, and politicization. Today, we will unmask the truth behind the Spartan myth.
This is Sparta!
Let us first begin by confronting the elephant in the room, the story that everyone knows. The last stand of bold Leonidas and his 300 against an army of 1 million Persians. This is the heart of the Spartan legend. A scene immortalized in painting, poem, song, book, comic, and film, each retelling, further embellishing an alternate history. However, the very foundations of the myth are challenged when we learn that the battle was never intended as a suicide mission, that there were 20 times more allied Greeks than Spartiates at the start of the fight, and almost 4 times as many allied Greeks there at the end.
I just want to state that even though they were made up a small portion of the army, history has proven time and time again that it never really, the amount of people you have, especially in warfare of this kind, the amount of numbers you have, if you're put in a strategic position, you can have a much smaller force. I mean, that's even true to today's standards, but, we have planes and stuff to bomb the crap out of things. If there's one defender, you can just bomb him away, as long as he's not in a populated city center. but some people don't care about that anyways. Anyways, even though the Spartans were the minority of the defenders, their prowess in battle, because they were the best. They were in one-on-one fighting, and as a logistical army together, they had the advantage there. Now, they did not have the advantage with the economy and in logistics, in which supplies. However, they probably knew how to forage pretty well so that they could remain supplied in foreign territories should they go on long campaigns into foreign land. But I think to undermine somewhat the idea of the power of the Spartan military by saying that they were the minority, I don't agree with that. I think to just acknowledge that, Spartans were a good military, but they weren't the only ones there. There were also a bunch of other Greeks there because this was an invasion of Greece. This invasion of Greece by the Persians unified the Greek city-states for a time period so that they weren't put under the Persian boot. I think I explained that well enough.
That the last stand was an anomaly in Spartan history. That 50 years later, they would be fighting fellow Greeks while being paid by the Persians. That the Spartans were not bred for war. That their oppressive society was built on the back of slavery. That for much of their history, they were admired for their political rather than military achievements. That their image over the years has been cherry-picked and twisted to fit countless narratives. This is the confused mess in which we find ourselves.
I can agree that they have been romanticized immensely. I can agree with that.
It is only recently that scholars have been able to turn a critical eye on much of what we think we know about the Spartans. Armed with these findings, we will now rewind the clock back before the emergence of the myth and rebuild.
Well, to be fair to historians of the past, there are certain things that occur in the development of history that can prevent things from happening like this. Perhaps years ago, decades ago, when the Spartans were becoming truly mythic in our modern sense, I guess, because obviously the mythicizing of Spartans has occurred for centuries, But for modern historians, or even 20th century historians, if you want a book to sell well, you have to write a certain way. Or sometimes if you want your book to get read in classes, you have to write a certain way. You have to do certain things in your book. And sometimes even, maybe, because publishers suck. Like, publishers just suck. That, especially in the historical fields, publishers suck, and they will try to title your book. I got this from a confirmation from one of my professors when my professor was releasing their first book. The publisher tried to push them to title it a certain way in which it was completely wrong about what their book was about. Like, there was a brief mention of this thing, for maybe less than a paragraph, maybe even just a sentence. This certain thing was mentioned. And the publisher tried to title the book based around that one sentence because it was eye-catching. It would get people to buy it. So when you're dealing with history books, you kind of have to remember that. Maybe the author, the historian, couldn't push the publisher to title it differently, or the publisher forced them to edit it in certain ways so that it would sell better. Because at the end of the day, kind of need money. Now, I'm not saying this is the case for everything. Obviously, we've gotten much better in the modern day, but in the past, that's kind of a thing that happened. And it still happens to this day where publishers are like, we got to title this a certain way so that it's eye-catching, even though your book may not be about this. So yes, I don't know exactly what the point I was trying to make, but there you go. A little insight on the history publishing field from what I know from talking to professors.
Build our understanding of Sparta from the ground up. The rise of Sparta. Sparta had originally been settled around the 10th century BCE in the Eurotas Valley of Laconia in the southeast Peloponnese. Its early development was rather typical, and it bore the hallmarks of many other Greek cities. During the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Sparta expanded regionally, conquering the neighboring people of Messenia and Laconia to rule one of the largest territories in Greece. These subject populations became a vast underclass of...
What's funny though about that, when you look at that map, back then that was a large amount of territory. But you look at the map today, and you just see Greece as this tiny nation. Like that's just crazy to me.
Helots, ruled over by a leisured Spartan elite. The resulting dynamics of this social structure would mark a turning point in Spartan history and drive its long-term evolution.
Yeah.
Many are quick to trace back
I mean, all societies back then essentially had slaves. If you conquered one people, you typically enslaved their populace. You know, that's what happened in war during this time. Anyone became a slave. Or, well, not anyone. Kind of anyone could become a slave.
their perceived military dominance to this moment. However, no contemporary sources from this period mention Sparta as having an abnormally martial culture or unique military institutions. Instead, it appears that their rise to power was gradual and can more readily be attributed to a strength in numbers than strength at arms. In fact, ancient stories seem to claim that it was Argos, which was famed for its warriors, while Sparta was known for its women. During the 7th century BCE,
I don't know much about the contemporary sources of that time, so I'm not going to comment.
many Greek city-states started to consolidate their internal order and formalize their laws. In Sparta, these were retroactively attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. Primarily, these included the establishment of a council of elders, which Plutarch credits with bringing stability to a government which had previously oscillated between the extremes of anarchy and dictatorship. Egalitarian-focused land reforms were also implemented, alongside new institutions for communal eating and schooling. While these are often pointed out as being uniquely Spartan, they were in fact features present to varying degrees in other Greek cities.
Okay.
In the 6th century BCE, Sparta switched its approach. They no longer took foreign territory
Uno reverse.
outright, turning conquered people into helots. Instead, they expanded by forcing other states into a system of unequal alliances we call the Peloponnesian League. Its members had to swear to follow wherever the Spartans led. Yet the contemporary evidence still does not depict them as unstoppable killing machines. Tellingly, at the legend,
I feel like I'm kind of getting this idea that he's arguing based off of, like, I feel like obviously you don't talk much about this time period in history classes, really, because it was so long ago, and you really kind of focus more on Rome than you do on Greece. This is probably briefly, the Peloponnesian Wars are mentioned for like 5 minutes in a class, and then you're immediately on to Alexander the Great conquering Persia. All right, Alexander the Great died. His empire is gone. All right, now we're to Rome. That's essentially history classes, you know? So this idea of them being so mythicized as this unstoppable machine, I think is wrong. I think his argument is what he's trying to argue against is kind of something that doesn't really exist. He's going off of a movie. He's going off of the 300 movie. Now, yes, I think if you were to talk to the regular person, they would say, yeah, the Spartans were unstoppable killing machines because of the 300 movie. So you talk about the 300 time period, the time period of the Persian invasion. We're not... This whole idea of the Spartan myth is around that time period. So that's what you should argue against. You should argue for that. Be arguing in that time period, not about the Peloponnesian League time period. Which I guess it's important for context a little bit. But I don't know. For me, for the way I form my arguments and the way I like my arguments to be argued, my points to be argued, if I were to argue against the Spartan myth of them being unstoppable killing machines, I would specifically be doing this video entirely on the the Battle of Thermopylae. Furthermore, if we were talking about the Spartan myth, I wouldn't be talking about their expansion and then talking about kind of like a lack of resources a little bit, where you just say contemporary sources show that they didn't have a abnormal military power. So you're looking at abnormality. That's, to me, I don't like that. It's hard to explain. It makes sense in my head, but I don't think I can properly explain it, so I'm not really gonna point it against him entirely. But if you want to disprove this idea of Spartans being undefeatable military machines, then you kind of just got to talk about their military losses. Yeah, right now he's not doing that. We'll see if the video progresses and changes into more of what I kind of feel it should argue about.
Legendary Battle of Champions in 5.
But I'm not saying that this is a bad video or that he's a bad researcher. He obviously clearly did his research, and it's a great job. He's done a great job. It's a great, well-made video so far. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying for my preference in how I like my arguments to be stated, you know.
545 BCE, Sparta and Argos are supposed to have matched their best 300 hoplites in a fight that would leave 2 Argives and 1 Spartan left standing. It would appear that this was no one-sided affair. Thermopylae.
Okay, now he's getting into Thermopylae. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about that battle between Argos and the Spartans. You stated earlier that Argos was seen as the military power. They were seen for being reputed as having the military power of Greece. They were the ones known for great warriors, while Sparta was known for their women. And then you talk about how Argos fought the Spartans equally, 300 to 300, and essentially in the end result, Spartans nearly tied with the Argos. There was 1 Spartan and 2 Argos left. To me, that tells me that actually the Spartan myth is holding up, and that they had a great military body, a military might there. So you're kind of having that there kind of undermines the point you were making previously.
By the time of the 5th century BCE, the Spartans had solidified their position as one of the primary leaders of Hellas. This presented them with a unique opportunity to achieve greatness with the outbreak of the Greco-Persian Wars. While the Spartans played a minor role in the First War, they would take supreme command of the anti-Persian forces in the larger invasion 10 years later. But as Greece was overrun, the coalition worried that the Spartans would elect to sacrifice the northern cities and instead defend their home base to the south. As a show of...
I mean, that's kind of a fair assumption by the allied Greeks to realize that. I mean, if I were the leader of Sparta, I kind of would... I'd be leaning towards that idea, not gonna lie. Because, you know, you've got that very narrow here, and there's not really too many... It's so mountainous in southern Greece, and, you know, not really too many good landing spots.
Of commitment, the Spartans decided to make a stand at Thermopylae. Contrary to popular belief, this was not a heroic suicide mission by Leonidas and the brave 300. Rather, it was the deployment of a small, mixed group of 7,000 hoplites to hold the pass while the rest of the levies were raised for an anticipated showdown with the main Persian army. However, Xerxes arrived sooner than the Greeks expected, sending the allied commanders into a panic. Herodotus tells us that many wished to retreat, but that it was the Phocians and Locrians, not the Spartans, who insisted on holding the line. Ultimately, Leonidas elected to stay, but sent requests for immediate reinforcements. There is no evidence he intended to fight to the death for glory's sake.
No one would fight to the death for glory's sake. Yeah, no. But I think from my understanding, since he's a warrior, he was there to do a duty. Hold that for as long as possible, and that's what he did.
Over the next 2 days, the Greek army took turns holding the pass at Thermopylae, while the navy defended the Straits of Artemisium. The encounter at sea was beginning to favor the Persians, and the land force was similarly threatened when an encircling goat path was revealed to the invaders. It is at this point that the majority of the Greek force abandoned the position. A small contingent composed of the surviving 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans.
Okay, so the Thespians and Thebans did stay with the Spartans. I thought they all left to retreat to regroup later.
Remained.
Except for the
We
Spartans.
will never know exactly what compelled Leonidas to stay. Regardless of the intent, however, the last stand at Thermopylae would become one of the most effective feats of propaganda in history. Becoming legend. Despite the Greeks failing all their objectives, the final decision to go down fighting allowed the Battle of Thermopylae to take on an enormous symbolic significance. This was a fact seized upon by the Spartans. Because it was their king who ultimately gave the order to stand, they could claim credit for the sacrifice, despite the Spartiates representing only a fifth of those who stayed behind.
True.
Thanks to carefully organized commemorations of the battle at home and at Thermopylae, the Spartans were able to take complete control of the ensuing narrative. It is telling that Herodotus, who writes of the fight almost 2 generations later, boasts that he had memorized the names of the 300 Spartans rather than any of the other participants.
What a mad lad.
This bias in our primary source colorizes his retelling of the battle by projecting backwards from a point in time when the Spartan myth had already begun to take root.
Well, I wouldn't even call Herodotus a primary source, because he didn't live during the time. So, Herodotus would actually be a secondary. Fuck, I think secondary source. I'm forgetting names.
It is an
of
incredible
sources.
testament to the enduring nature of this story that it takes precedence.
I swear I'm a historian. I am brain farting on the names of what you call sources, but if he is not writing from the time period in which it occurred, or shortly after it occurred, as in within a couple years, he is not a primary source. Herodotus is not a primary source for the Battle of Thermopylae. Okay? Just want that known. Herodotus is not a primary source for the Battle of Thermopylae. And he should not be seen as a primary source for the Battle of Thermopylae because 1, he did not live there, 2, he did not write about it within a few years of it occurring. Therefore, he is not a primary source. So that kind of weakens Invictus's argument here, calling him a primary source. I'm just going to chop that up to just being a mistake. I probably would have made that mistake, like doing all the amount of research needed for this video. A mistake like that can happen, and it's just a small one.
In history over the far more significant encounters at Salamis and Plataea, which ultimately led to the expulsion of the Persians. Suddenly, the Spartans were elevated as heroes, while the other participants were eclipsed and forgotten. The ensuing propaganda inflated their military reputation, which they eagerly exploited. What better way to stave off internal and external threats than to shield oneself in an aura of invincibility? The development of the Spartan myth was a result of their ensuing efforts to realize their legend. With this understanding, we can now finally turn our attention to see if they were ever able to live up to the hype. Bred for war. One of the most enduring concepts to come out of the Spartan myth is the idea that the Spartiates were raised from birth to become the world's finest warriors. This is wrong. In order to qualify this objection, let us look at the early years of a Spartan's life. One of the first claims of Spartan superiority is the practice of eugenics, whereby newborns were inspected and thrown off a cliff if deemed unfit. This story comes from Plutarch and is largely regarded as myth. That being said, infanticide is indeed believed to have occurred in the form of child abandonment, though this practice of exposure also took place across much of the Mediterranean, including amongst the Romans and other Greeks.
Yes, so I'm going to agree with him here. I don't think they would have thrown babies off the cliff. I think infanticide would happen if the baby was crippled, had issues in which they deemed that it wouldn't be able to survive, or it would be too much of an effort to care for it. And kind of being a crippled baby leans into that whole idea of not being able to care for it. Kind of like in the show Vikings, when Ivar is born, he's born with his broken legs. Ragnar is like, goes and leaves him in the woods because he doesn't want to care for, one, the child being broken, and two, he thinks that the child would live a horrible life because he'd be bullied and just picked on because he's crippled in the Viking lifestyle that is portrayed in the show.
Upon surviving birth, the first few years of childhood are accepted to have been typical of most Greeks, even by our ancient sources. At the age of 7, however, youths would be enrolled in the compulsory Spartan training program known as the agoge. Yet far from being a military academy for producing good soldiers, their upbringing was more focused on producing good citizens. Athleticism, obedience, and competition were certainly fostered, but these were never directly tied to battlefield skills. There is no evidence in their schooling of any weapons proficiency training at all. Rather, they would be taught to exercise, dance, and recite poetry under the direction of their elders, while tutors educated them on reading and writing. In its early form, this education would be rather similar to that of other Greek cities, though with a noted emphasis on austerity. Over time, it did eventually become more severe, in order to reflect how the Spartans wanted to be seen. Many of the harsher elements of the agoge would only be introduced long after Thermopylae. It seems that as Sparta's reputation waned, the rigors of schooling increased as a way to sustain their identity. This differentiation generated prestige, which drew the attention of many aristocratic families from other cities who sought to enroll their sons. By the time of the Roman conquests, Sparta was but a pale shadow of its former self. Nonetheless, its hard education became something of an antique theme park that drew visitors wishing to experience a glorious past that had never been true. Super soldiers. Having analyzed their youth, we will now follow the Spartans into adulthood and see what kinds of soldiers they became. This transition began around the age of 20, when students graduated from the agoge and joined the Spartan army. For the next 10 years, their lives would be centered around one of several communal messes. Entry into these groups required the consent of all its members, and failure to gain approval by the age of 30 meant that an individual would be denied full citizenship. Based solely on the Spartan myth, we might expect that these 10 years were spent as professional soldiers, mastering the art of war. Once again, however, our popular expectations are confounded. Spartans were not professionals in the modern sense, and they did not form a standing army. They were not paid and controlled by the state. They did not make their living off soldiers.
You're using our modern definition of professional. Use the contemporary definition of professional for that time period to argue for it. If they do not meet the professional standards of their time period, then they aren't professionals. But saying that they aren't professionals by our modern standards is wrong.
Soldiery, and they were not always under arms. Much like other Greeks, Spartan hoplites were a militia force that served as a civic duty. The main difference was that while most other Greek troops returned to a life of labor, Spartans returned to a life of profiting off the labor of others. They were landed elites overseeing a vast underclass that worked almost every aspect of their economy.
And by the way, if you're a landed elite, you are going to be a proficient. Typically, you would be a proficient military soldier because since you have the time, you don't have to waste your time working. I guess waste. Instead, you can focus your time on training. And that is typically, especially we see this in the medieval times. Nobles would be skilled warriors, generally, because they had the time to practice sword and lance. well, nobles that wanted to. They had the time, Possibly not generally, but a good amount, I would say. Obviously, there's going to be the lazy ones that don't want to do that. But, if you are a knight, you are going to be a trained military person, as would a Spartan back then. Certainly, there were lazier Spartans that just wanted to live the life of leisure and didn't want to train. But you have so much time on your hands, you're probably going to train.
This rich man's life was the envy of many Greeks. But if the Spartans had all this free time, surely it must have been spent training to be the best of the best.
What I was saying.
While it is true that they did dedicate time to hard exercise and enforce moderation, this was not explicitly militaristic. Neither Plutarch nor Xenophon make mention of martial arts, weapons training, mock combat, or group training exercises.
But being extremely physically fit is extremely useful in war. I'm going to kind of do what he's been doing and bring in modern examples. Take the American soldier and compare it to I'd say probably the best current land military in Europe, aside from the Russians. And that would be the French and the British. Specifically the French, because the French have a pretty sizable military. I think they might be bigger than the British military at this point in time. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've checked the source. But the average American soldier is built. They are strong. They are tall. They are muscular. The average French soldier is shorter and weaker. From a couple of actual former French veterans or soldiers that I've seen talk online, they have stated that the strongest French soldier in the company would probably be equal to the average American soldier. Even though the French forces might maybe have a bigger emphasis on weapons training, the Americans also have an emphasis on stamina and strength. That stamina and strength allows them to carry more resources, therefore they're better for war, because then they can carry more resources, which allows them to worry less a little bit on the logistical side, because if they can carry more resources, you don't have to worry about getting those same resources over there in as high of numbers. Very brief explanation. But yes, hard exercise, being physically fit, is, in my opinion, nearly as important as weapons training. Obviously, there are things when it comes to weapons training in which, if you're very proficient with a weapon, you can beat a man bigger than you, because that is the point of a weapon. A sword is meant to be an equalizer between body size. But if a Spartan has been training a lot to exercise, they've been running a lot or whatever, they have that stamina and strength, they will be able to fight way longer than the other Greeks. If they have that stamina, fight longer, then, and you can say the Spartan's able to live long enough, that's kind of going to nullify that whole weapons training that the other Greek did. Because if that Greek can't hit the Spartan, and he tires out, while that Spartan's able to hold on because of his immense stamina that he trained for, he's going to win the fight.
That are the
very long, unnecessarily long explanation there. I'm sorry.
bedrock.
But I don't know. There's just something with the way he's posing this argument that's kind of... I think if you were to update this video for today, because I think this is a fairly old video on his channel, I think there are things that he would probably change and probably pose his argument better. But the way the argument is being posed to me right now from this video, I'm kind of not really liking it.
Of today's boot camps. When not called upon by the state, they went about their duties as estate holders. They sang and danced, they drank together, they rode horses and raced chariot teams, they hunted, they played games.
Hunting. That's pretty important. That can be useful in war.
They slept around.
Slept
At the
around.
Olympics, the Spartans were not particularly notable winners outside of the most upper-class event, the chariot race. In the end, this leaves us with an understanding that the Spartans were something of a cross between a militia and a landed aristocracy. The evidence suggests that qualitatively they had the potential to produce top-tier Greek warriors, but they were by no means unmatched in this capacity.
I don't think really too many people are arguing that they were unmatched. You know, it's just known that they were great soldiers. They just had a good average of good soldiers.
Craftsmen of war. While individual Spartan soldiers may not have been particularly formidable, Spartans working together were much more impressive.
Yeah, and that's kind of how they fought. I don't think anyone's ever talking about an individual Spartan. I think they're talking about how they worked together as a group. And they were very well organized, and that's what made them deadly.
Among the Greeks, they were the only ones to develop a command structure that went down to the platoon level with their own officers. This chain of command offered more tactical options than just charging at whatever was in front of them. Spartan forces could maneuver on the battlefield, swiftly following orders and wheeling or changing face as the situation demanded. This was done while marching to the sound of flutes. Such disciplined control also allowed them to advance into battle while walking, which proved psychologically intimidating to untrained enemies. On campaign, the Spartans enforced their command structure and drill formations upon allied forces, raising the overall combat efficiency of coalition armies.
Again, you're kind of destroying your own argument that this Spartan myth of them being this great military power. You're destroying that argument. You're proving that they were a great military power because they were very effective in their drilling. So,
They were able to win several major battles as
again, that's proving the point you're against.
a result of this unique ability.
I'm just confused as to what he's trying to argue for. I'm sorry, I'm just confused. I'm not mad or anything. I'm just confused as to what he's arguing for now.
The Spartans extended their organization to other aspects of their military as well.
Like tactical
This included
superiority
assigning
is
specific
extremely
officers to
important.
take care of supplies and detaching specialist troops for the task of guarding the camp or scouting ahead of the marching column. Such was their reputed expertise that when allies asked them
it's
for help,
Faramir.
they were known to send a single advisor rather than an army. Though as we shall see later, this may have had other causes. However, the main drawback of Sparta's specialization was that it was only applied to a single aspect of the army, the hoplite phalanx. They failed to develop
That's a
competent
fair
light
argument.
infantry or
Yes.
cavalry, which led to an inability to fuel well-rounded forces without the support of allies. In the long run, this stagnation would be their Achilles heel.
Yes, I can agree with this.
Performance in battle. Now that we have discussed the Spartans on the individual and unit level, we can assess how they performed overall on the battlefield. The most striking measure of their success is the fact that they were undefeated in pitched battles for over a
Again, proving the side that you are seemingly against.
century and a half. This is thoroughly impressive. However, as always, we will dig beneath the surface of such claims. It must be stated that during this time, they did suffer losses in smaller battles, skirmishes, ambushes, sieges, and naval engagements. These were
Okay.
more numerous during this period, as pitched battles were actually relatively rare. When we compare Sparta's overall performance against those of their peers, statistics seem to indicate they performed only marginally better than other leading city-states, such as Athens and Corinth.
But they still
It
performed
should
better.
also be pointed out that Sparta never again fought to the death, as at Thermopylae. Despite the popular notion of the invincible and aggressive Spartans, the evidence seems to bear out that they were actually far more reluctant fighters than other powers. For instance, during the 5th century BCE, it was the Athenians who initiated more battles than any other Greek state. Our sources reinforce this notion by pointing out that the Spartans were notoriously cautious when it came to committing their forces.
But probably because they wanted to
This
win.
can be attributed to two major factors: the threat of internal revolt and rapidly declining population numbers.
As I stated very early on in the video, about the population, because they were so militaristic, supposedly, if they were truly focused on war, then yeah, they would have a declining population because their men would be trained for war and they would be sent off to do war things, and therefore they're not home to make the babies.
The danger of an uprising was always a looming threat for the Spartans. This
They
was
did
a
have
result
a lot
of
of
their
slaves.
hierarchical social structure,
He is right here.
whereby they had set themselves up as a ruling elite over an underclass that greatly outnumbered them. These helots were suppressed through fear and intimidation. If, however, the Spartans appeared weak, the tables might turn. For instance, an earthquake in 464 BCE sparked a major revolt that deeply traumatized the Spartans. Throughout their history, Sparta had to negotiate internal oppression and exploitation, which made them careful not to shift too many men away from home. A shrinking Spartiate population further exacerbated these problems. This was largely the result of Sparta's strict control over who could become a full citizen. It seems that land fragmentation, resulting from equal inheritance laws, combined with the consolidation of plots by the wealthy, severely limited the ability of individuals to maintain the cost of citizenship. At its height, in the late 6th century BCE, Sparta boasted 8,000 citizens, but within 2 centuries that had dropped to 1,000.
God damn.
By comparison, we should note that Athens, at its height, had around 60,000 male
Yeah,
citizens.
that would
In
do it.
order to compensate for such differences, the Spartans relied increasingly on others to do the fighting for them. This would include diluting their own ranks with non-Spartiates, or taking command of allies and mercenaries by merely dispatching small officer groups. It was only when Spartan interests were directly threatened, or the reputation of Sparta itself was at stake, that their army would march out in full force. At all other times, the Spartan myth was their best defense.
I mean, that's propaganda for you, yeah.
The Spartan myth. As we have seen, Thermopylae was the spotlight that gave Sparta its moment of fame. This proved to be a golden opportunity, and to their credit, the Spartans were able to put on a great show. A well-rehearsed tough guy act was enough to convince their audience and win an empire. In the end, however, they were a strong man that couldn't take a punch when it finally came.
No, that's
This
wrong.
is best evidenced by the Battle of Leuctra in
He's not talking about just how vastly outnumbered they were in that battle.
371 BCE, when Thebes defeated the Spartans, killing 400 Spartiates, a third of their citizens' body, and shattering their image. The Spartans were unable to recover from this blow and fell
There you
into
go.
a terminal
That's what you should be arguing about. This kind of thing here, the Battle of Leuctra, this should have been the focus of the video.
decline. Nonetheless, once off the stage, stories of their performance grew with each retelling, only to be recorded by Greek and Roman authors. This was then passed on to scribes and scholars down the years, ultimately culminating in the modern evolution of the Spartan myth with which we started this episode. I hope that by the end of this video, we have been able to effectively use the latest historical findings of the past decade to set the record straight. But the story doesn't have to end here. If you are interested in finding out more,
I think this is still a well-made video. He did a bunch of his own research, and that should be merited. Yes, it's still a great video, even though I have my disagreements with it. That is a thing that can happen for those that don't know. You can disagree, and you can still appreciate the work that they did. And I do agree with him on some aspects. However, the way he posed his argument is solely what I have problems with. His focus of the video was to debunk the Spartan myth, but to me, all he did was strengthen it by saying, yeah, they were undefeated for 150 years. They did lose some skirmishes though, but they were still undefeated for 150 years. He didn't talk about how vastly outnumbered they were in the Battle of Thermopylae, which is extremely important in understanding that battle. And not to mention they ended up getting completely surrounded. There's a lot that happened in Thermopylae. That goat pass was defended by some local soldiers. But when the Persians discovered the path, what they did was they then made those defenders think that their homes was about to be ransacked by the Persians. So those defenders along the goat path left the goat path to go defend their homes. And that's when the Persians went around the goat path and behind the defending Greek coalition force. And it isn't until he gets to that battle between the Spartans and Thebes where he kind of starts to prove his point. But that's when the video is ending. Is they lost this battle that decimated their decimated their population. And they would really never recover from that. That's what you needed to focus on. This other stuff, you kind of just ended up kind of being a weak argument, in my opinion, and not really furthering your argument, but also not. Much of this video was kind of just a history of Sparta and not really proving his point, but also not disproving his point, if that makes sense. So I personally think that possibly he should probably revisit this video. I can understand why he wouldn't. But I think he should probably revisit this video and I think the argument just needs to be shifted a bit and the focus needs to be shifted a bit more clearer, I guess, so to speak. And then I think he could make something really good. I think his videos now are fantastic, by the way. I do think he's a good YouTuber. I do think he's a good history YouTuber. I think this video is kind of a misstep, though. I think if he were to remake it, I think he could do a much better job in posing his argument, because as time goes on, you do get better at posing your arguments. Like, the arguments I would make in papers I wrote in high school are completely weak compared to the arguments that I can pose now in university. No, that's the evolution of being a writer / historian. That's how everyone is, and I'm certain he could probably do a much better job and better pose the argument he's trying to fight for here. So yeah, I'm gonna leave a link down below to his channel. I do think you guys should check him out. He is a great YouTuber. I love his videos. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more. Thank you.